These 4 watercolor techniques will totally change your watercolor practice. These are the 4 techniques: scraping, lifting, glazing, and grainer brush. First, I'm going to show you how to do each technique, and then we're going to put all 4 techniques into practice with the painting of this blackbird. Grab the reference photo and the tracing for this blackbird in the description. Scraping is simply scraping off the layer of paint to reveal the paper underneath. Now you can scrape to reveal paint that has already dried underneath, or you can scrape to reveal paper, providing that you used a paint color that doesn't stain too much. I love scraping for small whiskers, fur, and feathers. The first thing you're going to do is put down a layer of paint. Now the hard part is you have to wait until it's almost dry, like 10 seconds away from being completely dry. This takes practice. You can use a lot of different tools to scrape away the paint. My favorite is a pointy palette knife, but you can use a credit card, a plastic fork, your fingernail, the backside of a paintbrush, and you can practice scraping large areas or nice thin lines. You'll see here that we tried to scrape away just a single layer of quinacridone gold, which is a staining color, so it does stain your paper. You won't get it completely back to white, but it does make the paint lighter and give you that nice scraped look. Then I laid down a layer of rich opera pink, over that quinacridone gold after it had dried, and scraped it away to reveal the quinacridone gold underneath. Once you try scraping, especially with animal portraits, pet portraits, and birds especially, you will totally fall in love. Now, the other thing you should know about scraping is that if you try to scrape while the paint is still a little too wet, you will actually make it a dark line. Instead of scraping the paint away, you'll kind of indent the paper and your pigments will fall into that indent, making it a dark line. So you can kind of use scraping in 2 different ways. Now let's talk about lifting. Basically, you're going to have a dry area of paint, completely dry, and then use a wet brush, not sopping wet, kind of just barely wet, to scrub the paint off the paper using your wet brush. Now, I'm kind of adding a little bonus technique in here by showing you water resist. So the area that's painted ultramarine in this lifting section hasn't completely dried. And what I'm doing is laying down water, plain water, onto that area, and it's actually pushing the paint away, revealing a little bit of a lighter layer. Technically, it's not lifting. You're not lifting pigment off the paper. You're just laying down water to push the pigment out. But it's especially helpful to practice this technique, this water resist technique, for beginners, just to understand how watercolor works. And it's a cool technique to have in your arsenal. Now that the paint has fully dried, you can use a wet brush, not crazy wet, just barely wet. Scrub that paint off the surface. It might take a couple passes, dabbing on a rag or a Kleenex to clean your brush, dipping in water, scrubbing the excess water off on that same rag, and then lifting the paint off the paper. Next, we have glazing, which I utilize in every painting I do. It's basically just layers of paint. It's just layering paint over paint that has already dried to give it an extra layer of color. Now, you know that I like to talk about highlight colors and shadow colors, and usually that means glazing over areas that I've already painted. Just make sure when you are glazing that the paint underneath is completely 100% dry. And last, but definitely not least, is simply getting yourself a grainer brush. Grainer brushes are great for what I call the 3 F's: feathers, fur, and foliage. It's a brush that's set up so the bristles are sparse at the top, allowing you to get individualized little lines instead of a big stroke. I didn't even know these existed. I stumbled upon it by accident when I was looking at brushes one day online, and I can't believe I ever painted without one. If you paint, again, feathers, fur, or foliage, you have to get yourself a grainer brush. It will save you so much time and heartache and make painting fun again. Okay, let's get into putting all the techniques together to paint this blackbird. Of course, I'm starting by tracing my image onto my painting surface. I have a video that shares how I like to do that, but you can use whatever method you prefer. For this painting, we're just using 4 colors. We have neutral tint, buff titanium, rich opera pink. It's that opera pink color that I think Cheap Joe's just renamed. And then a tiny bit of ultramarine blue that we'll be using in the bird's eye. All the rest of the supplies that I'm using are listed in my supply list that you can get for free as a PDF download at paint333.com. Okay, your bird is traced, you have your supplies ready, let's paint. I'm starting this painting by just laying down water on the base that the bird is standing on. Once I have a nice big pool that's outlining his feet, I'm dropping in neutral tint and buff titanium. Then I'm just using a pencil to pull that colorful water up into his feet and kind of distinguishing the features and the wrinkles in his feet by using the pencil as a tool to manipulate that paint water. This is also a really fun technique that technically we're not supposed to be covering in this video, but I think you'll have a lot of fun using a pencil as a tool to pull heavy saturated areas of water into other areas of your painting. Now we're going to let that dry and come in with our first layer on our eye. I'm just using neutral tint to paint the darkest darks in the eye. The biggest thing with eyes is you want to save white space for the reflections. I would err on painting less than painting too much. Then I'm just painting a little bit on his beak to establish the darkest dark areas there. Again, this is all with a heavy mix of neutral tint onto dry paper. Now we're going to let those areas dry and move on to the wings. We're going to use the same technique to paint the wings that we did to paint the rock that the bird is standing on. Dropping in water at the base of the wings, a nice heavy puddle of water. Coming in and dropping neutral tint, a really strong mix of neutral tint into that water. And unfortunately my phone camera cut out right here, and I was really sad because it was really fun to watch how I painted this part of the bird. But it's the same technique that we used for the feet, where after we put that color into that water, I'm using a pencil to pull the water into the other areas of his wings to distinguish the lines in his wings. So I'm jumping right into basically the wings being done here, but you can do it. You can see how I did it and just copy that if you'd like. And you'll see both when I did the wings and when I did the rock base, my plain water had a little bit of color in it, and that was just so you could see it as a viewer. Otherwise, it's really hard to see how much water I was using if I didn't put some color in it. Then I come in with some water on his beak to soften those black areas we had already laid down, using my pencil to pull it around and distinguish some feathers around his beak. So my three-step process goes paint with water, plain water, which we've been doing, lay down color, darks to lights, which we've also been doing, and then finish with texture techniques, again, which we've also been doing, especially on the rock base and the wings. With the eye and the beak, and typically with pet portraits on their faces and their nose and their eyes and sometimes in their ears, I will lay down dark neutral tint kind of outlines on dry paper before I start the three-step process, and you see that we kind of did that here too. But the three-step process is pretty much what I use to paint almost everything else. So we're laying down water, we're adding neutral tint, we're using our pencil to push that paint around, and now finally we're getting to one of the 4 techniques we're supposed to be talking about in this video, which is the grainer brush. You'll see that I'm just pulling that neutral tint paint color into areas of dry paper using the grainer brush. My grainer brush typically is just slightly wet. If it's too wet, you won't have those distinguished lines. So make sure you dab it in the water and then blot it on your rag. And now we're getting to scraping to distinguish some of those feathers in the black areas of the bird. Next, we're going to glaze. So before we do that, let your bird dry completely. We're using a mix of buff titanium and that rich opera pink color, very muted, so not a ton of pink, mostly buff titanium, and we're laying it down on the lower belly of the bird and pulling it into the background. I'm not a fan of a big complex background, but pulling a little bit of color that's already in your subject into the background can be really interesting and fun. To finish off the iris, we're going to go in and drop some ultramarine blue right around the reflections, the white areas that we had saved, softening the edges while we go. The great thing is your reflections don't have to be perfect. They don't even have to really match the reference photo. But what you want to do is have the ultramarine blue be next to the reflections, followed by the neutral tint. Here's a nice close-up of the finished eye that I did, so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. Then I'm going in with a heavy mix of neutral tint on my round brush to create some more detail around his beak and around his eye. Now I really want to incorporate more scraping around his head area, so I'm going to add another layer of neutral tint around his head and around his eye, and right before that dries, coming in with my palette knife to scrape sections away so it looks like his feathers are framing his face a little bit. And finally, we're going to incorporate lifting, again to accomplish the same thing, to increase the look of the feathers that are around his eye on his head. So coming in with a barely wet but clean brush, dabbing excess water off on a rag, and scrubbing the paint away, using your round brush. It might take a couple passes to get it back to the lightness that you're looking for. Now you'll see in the reference photo with this blackbird that his black feathers, especially on his body near the wings, have this beautiful iridescent shine. So again, we're going to use the technique of glazing, but this time with a simple glitter paint. I found this at Walmart. It's just a simple glitter acrylic paint. It looks white, but it dries clear other than the glitter. Now, if you work this too hard, you will lift up the paint that's underneath it. So just make sure you lay down your layer of glitter where you want it, and then kind of leave it alone. It should be a thin layer, but don't overwork it too much. The final step is a little bit of splatter, which I just put a somewhat heavy mix, kind of a medium heavy mix of neutral tint onto my brush and splatter it over wherever I would like the splatter to be. You can protect areas of your painting with a piece of scratch paper before you splatter to make sure it doesn't go where you don't want it to go. And then you can even add in little splatters by hand to achieve the vision you had for the splatter. Just don't do too much splatter. I think less is more. I also used lifting to create a little bit of a circle outline on the bottom right side of his eye, and I think that looks really nice. Whether or not you went along and painted this bird with me, I hope you learned a lot about these 4 techniques and got some ideas and inspiration for how to incorporate them into your next painting. Don't forget to go to paint333.com to grab your supply list where you can see the exact brushes I used and the paper I like to use. I used the Fabriano Studio. So this is a student grade paper. It's not a professional 100% cotton paper, but I love it. It's a really nice paper and it's a great cheap option if you don't have a big budget for paper, because paper is expensive. Turn on notifications and subscribe to my channel so you don't miss my next video. Happy painting!